and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. So Malaysia has unveiled its 2026 to 2035 Education Development Plan, which lays out a vision for how our schools, our teachers and our students will evolve over the next decade. Now comes the hardest bit, delivery. What happens when these reforms meet real classrooms? Tonight on the show, we hope to stress test the blueprint, what it would take to make some of these reforms work in reality, in practice. Joining me on the show to stress test the blueprint is Cheryl Fernando, who is director of the Global Institute, which is an initiative of Teach for All. She also previously led Pemimpin GSL in Malaysia, which focused on developing school and teacher leaders, nationwide. I also have with me in the studio Danial Rahman, who is the CEO of the Asian Strategy and Leadership Institute, better known as ASLI. He has previously worked across 3 federal ministries: finance, education, higher education, and he was involved as a reviewer and an industry expert for both education blueprints. So welcome to the show, both of you. Thank you for joining me for this conversation. There's so much to discuss, but I do want to begin with some of the reversals that we've been seeing with the implementation of the blueprint. And I like to start there, if it's possible, the work that goes into turning policy into practice. When we have something like this, and at a moment where public anxiety is quite high regarding the blueprint, what do you think evidence-based decision-making looks like, particularly with education? If I may begin with you, Cheryl.
Thanks, Melisa. Thanks for having me. So I think with any policy announcement, I'm quite certain that the ministry actually did their due diligence. Like they actually, they checked, they spoke to teachers, they spoke to many stakeholders before actually coming up with the policy announcement. But of course, what we see was just that, okay, the PMX announcing it, and then everyone's like, oh, surprise, we didn't know. But I know that there's a lot of like back-end work that goes into this before they announce the policy. But I think it's always the after that is not done like nicely. Like, so after you announce the policy, it needs to be supplemented with a very clear communications plan so that people are not anxious and people understand clearly what do these terms mean. Right. And especially even like politicians, like everybody needs to understand why they announce this policy and what are the measures they're going to take in place to help the implementation of these policies. Right. I think when it comes with just an announcement without all of these measures, that's when people start getting anxious and they make their own assumptions, or they make like assumptions of how they think the policy is going to turn out to be. And that's when you will see like reversals of these policies, because then if you're unsure or you're like, oh, okay, did we make a mistake? Like then you start backing out of this, only because I think the groundwork is there before the policy announcement, but it's not there after. Okay. So I think that's when you will see like these reversals, or people, their lack of understanding of why these things have to happen.
So comms must be aligned from everyone. So after the fanfare of the big launch, we have to make sure that comms are aligned and policy is communicated. Dan, I want you to respond to that, but if I may just add, how do you see policy reversals? Do you see it as reversals, or do you see it as kind of testing the waters and responding to feedback?
Okay. I think at the end of the day, Mel, it goes back to the magnitude of the impact. The purpose of the diagnostic test was fundamentally to ascertain the readiness of 6-year-olds in order to enter school. But upon taking a step back, and I've not got insights as to what happened behind the scenes, but at least based from research, we know that students, if they go in at 6 years old, and if it is a universal acceptance, they will still be able to learn, they'll still be able to assimilate and gain what the education wants to achieve. So in that regard, the diagnostic test would not have become a necessity in the short term, right? How it looks, and what we remember is this was also from parliamentary debates. And I know for a fact that as they were having these discussions, whether they have the diagnostic test, what it might look like, how parents might react. And eventually this is what leadership's about. The Prime Minister stepping up, of course in consultation with the Minister of Education, saying we'll do away with the diagnostic test. Now we've seen this happen in history when the dual language program was introduced back in 2015. The idea initially was let any student who wanted to enter the dual language class, but then the ministry back then put a test to say that if you want to enter, you have to pass a certain aptitude test or certain comprehension test. And that caused a lot of controversy because parents were like, oh, my child speaks English at home, but why didn't they get into? Because they couldn't. So even if there's a test, it's not necessarily the best way forward. What's important is to go back to the fundamentals, which is the learning outcomes. If we made it universal, could children still ascertain the objectives of education? And I think yes, without the diagnostic test.
Okay, so your sense of reversals is that it could be a good thing, but how do we manage that? Because reversals really, there's a risk of these, I might just use the term pivots, just to be more neutral. It undermines trust, right? It undermines trust amongst educators, amongst parents, even with the students. They have all this uncertainty.
Yeah. Yep, and remember when we were students a long, long time ago, that when there was the PTS exam, you know, for Standard 3, Standard 5, when we, even more recently, students, was PMR going to be around, now there's PT3 and all that. So I was in government when all these decisions were being made. I fully agree with Cheryl that that discussions, consultations, engagements are really important. We are still at that early stage of what this new blueprint means, so there's still some room for the government to be proactive in these policy pronouncements, but not anymore, right? The diagnostic test, reversal, if you were to call it that, and I think there was some other, how do we implement this? Is it optional for parents to send? Is it compulsory? What happens to preschool? So the government has leeway to some extent because it is a goodwill because of the blueprint, and we know that the plan, that is going to be a monumental shift, but nothing for too long.
Shouldn't all these have been worked out before the plan was launched? Help me correct my thinking. The plan is just a direction setting, right? It's not policy. I'm just wondering, wouldn't all these operational policy implementations have been thought through before the plan was announced, or as the plan was being put together? Is that how the thinking was when the plan was being put together?
Yeah, but short answer is yes. Most of these plans are in place and how to go about it. But and we have to remember that there are many things in the plan, right? There's the introduction of the exams.
So many
there's
things.
The diagnostic test. There's bringing schooling years earlier, more allocation for teachers. So the diagnostic test, year 6 entry is just one part of it, right? And I think it is and we need to be dynamic enough to say this diagnostic test is not necessarily still for the greater good of the learning outcome. So we go back to that. So call it what you may, but I think that in this context, there's still enough goodwill, there's still enough planning in place to ensure that the rollout achieves the outcomes that it needs to achieve.
Cheryl, do you agree?
I think we always have this impression that we need to be like, we need to wait for the system to be ready before we implement any policy. But then the truth is that will never happen, right?
Okay,
We're going to be waiting forever. And I think the way all these policies were introduced is for it to be matched to international standards. Like we know that students are starting school earlier in whether international schools or whether across the world, and they are also graduating early. So in order for us to adapt to this, we should get them to start school at 6. I think that was one. But then also then people say, but then you should wait for the whole system to be ready. That means classrooms enough, schools enough, teachers enough before you introduce the policy. I think that will take forever, impossible for it to be ready.
Okay.
But I think there must be some extent, at least like 50% of like readiness to be able to implement these policies. And I think hence that's why they said, okay, it's optional so that you don't like, the school is not ended up with like so many students in that first year. Okay. So you say, okay, you can send them if they are ready. That's why the diagnostic to put there to test whether the student has the competencies or the skills ready for year 1. Because once you go into year 1, it's full on like literacy, numeracy, you need to have all the skills ready. And with the large class sizes in Malaysia, a teacher would struggle with like the different varying needs of the students there. So hence, I thought the diagnostic was a good idea so that you can measure, not to stigmatize the child. I mean, we have like kelas pemulihan, we have all these other interventions in place, not to stigmatize, but to ensure that we are reducing the gap. So if the child is not ready, it's fine, then you can do 2 more years in Tadika, in Kindi, before moving to year 1. But I just think it was a comms problem. Like if you don't communicate this very clearly, like this diagnostic is not to stigmatize, but in order for us to stagger the policy so that hopefully in 3 years, then every 6-year-old is ready to do year 1. And the policy must also be like equity based, right? It's not equality. Like equity means we are ensuring that the students who are struggling, we can provide them the 2 years of support, and the students who are ready, then they can go to year 1. But I think there's many like different ways to look at this, especially with this year 6, the 6-year-old and the diagnostic test. And,
May I quickly add on? I think the question becomes, how ready is a child really? Currently in preschool, only about 200,000 preschoolers enter at age 5 or 6, right? What happens to the rest who then goes in straight to standard 1 at year 7? So that's a question mark. Now, by bringing it forward to year 6, yes, perhaps not all children may be ready, but we are actually now giving them a chance, i.e. those who are the 200,000 more, of accessing education earlier. What needs to change, and I concur with Cheryl on this, is also how the schools approach education. Yes, you get full-on literacy, numeracy, and now they all talk about digital skills, but it's at the end of the day about the approach. Will children will teachers have the space in order to properly develop the child's numeracy and literacy skills at 6? And ultimately, that's what the education system should be about.
Right. Well, Cheryl, your first-hand experience, and I want to move this conversation beyond just the diagnostics, because I think it's important, but it's only one example of what needs to be addressed. When you look at some of the potential reforms or potential policies that the blueprint, the plan has announced, where do you think the operational pressures might be most for schools? Where are the areas where you think, if we need to get this right, that 50% we need to get ready?
I think it's potentially it could be the year 4 examination. So every time you introduce any standardized examination, I think it puts a lot of pressure automatically on teachers, on students, on parents, right? Because this exam will come from the Lembaga Peperiksaan. So anytime there is a standardized exam, the pressure is there. And I think teachers will then go back to what we had when we had our UPSR to like, okay, have I finished the syllabus? Am I making sure that the students are passing the exams? Like, what will it take, right? I think that is the operational pressure that the school and the teachers will face with the year 4 exam. But the good thing is that it's now in year 4. So it's not a determiner for them to go to a certain type of secondary school. It doesn't become too much of pressure
to high stakes,
to the next level, but it's done in the middle. So I think then it can clearly assess the gap that's there so that they ensure that they are ready for secondary school, or they have 2 more years to be ready before they go into secondary school. But I think anytime a standardized exam is introduced, the pressure is there. Parents, teachers, students, everyone gets stressed, right? Because you have to sit for a high stakes exam.
Okay, Dan, what about you? Where do you see the operational pressure points for schools?
Definitely the surge that we'll be seeing next year. So every year about 400,000 plus students enter year 1. Next year, even if only 50% of 6-year-olds opt in, parents want to opt in, that's 600,000 in the cohort. And it can go as high as 800,000, right? And already we have schools, especially in urban areas, which are oversubscribed. Some classrooms have more than 40, sometimes 50 students. Teachers are already feeling the burden. We've seen, nevertheless, the Education Ministry, not just in the blueprint, but before this, take steps to address these issues. So teacher fulfillment is at an all-time high, 98%. They're also now introducing classroom assistants. Right? Now, for the blueprint, to address the surge capacity, the ministry just announced 20,000 new spots, 800 million ringgit, and even allowing mid-career professionals without an education background to come in. They've talked about IBS, industrial building structures, to augment it. But I think the question that I ask myself is society, or are we all really aware of how big an effort this is? Because mind you, Melisa, this isn't just what's going to happen in 2027. There'll also be a surge in 2028. And this surge cohort will last for the next 13 years. Or as I like to put it, it will outlive the blueprint. It will outlive at least 2 or 3 more Malaysia plans. It will likely outlive 3 general elections along the way. So the question is, are we really ready as a country to facilitate this movement, which I've kind of likened to a wartime mobilization effort?
Tell me about that. So you wrote an opinion piece on this, and you talked about the need for us to approach this with a kind of war mentality, war-like mobilization effort.
That's right.
Can you explain? That was quite startling to me just from reading it, but explain why you think we really need this approach.
Sure, and it's in no way about trivializing the notion of war and such. But the idea is, when wars happen, this whole society and nation have to come together, right? People have to sacrifice resources, people have to step up and go beyond and meet the call of duty. And in the context of education, it's a question of, are there Malaysians who may have graduated in non-education fields who are willing to come and join the education ministry for this purpose? Are there private sector entities that are willing to open up their buildings, for example, to say, we'll let you use these as schools for the next 12 to 13 years? Are there preschools that might say, you know what, we've already got over 10,000 preschool classes in the country. Can we now use these preschool classes, which already teach 6-year-olds, but for year 1 primary equivalent? And in addition to that, the government then has to also realize that it's not just an education ministry effort, it is an effort that cross-cuts all ministries, private sector, parents, teachers, and the likes. And is that coordination happening in the way that we need to? Again, keeping in mind that this will end most likely in 2039 or 2040 before the system normalizes.
I'm surprised at the scale of time that it would take for this to, just based on that, feels quite a long time. The impact will be felt for many, many years. Cheryl, what do you think this education plan demands of teachers and school leaders?
I think so. Number one is to not be stuck in the way of thinking as we did in 1995. I think whenever people think of education, they always say oh, back in my day, it was very different.
Yeah, that's true.
This is how I used to teach my kids, and it worked. So we have to let go of what used to work and to be open to what's going to work, because we are preparing our students for jobs that don't exist, right? Preparing them for the future. So in order to do that, I think teachers and school leaders need to be really open this whole idea around holistic student development, not at the expense of mastery, but also ensuring that the students' mental health, their well-being, all the skills that will last through all these changing technologies is there in the education system. I think that's so important. Yeah. And I think whatever I remember most in my schooling days was all these other things that we used to do, right? To be part of the debate and things like that. And how do we continue to build this skill in our students? I think that's very important. And to move away from that, I think Malaysia, we are still very stuck in that academic, we want that academic rigor. So when the removal of UPSR, teachers and parents were oh, but now what is there to study for, right? But the whole idea was that for the country to move towards a more holistic assessment, where it's more mastery based, and it's not too much of you're just measuring a child. But then it became very difficult. So now they reintroduced back the year 4 exam. So there's at least something for people to anchor on if they really want to see academic results. But also I think that holistic development, a lot of countries are moving towards this, and we really need to start embracing this.
What kind of support would teachers need if that's the goal, especially just using your example of the year 4 exams, trying to avoid it becoming the standardized exams back to what we're trying to move away from?
Yeah. I think
what support is needed?
I always go back to this one example when we think of mental well-being or social emotional well-being. A lot of times we see this as a separate from the syllabus that we are teaching. But a lot of training and support development actually now focuses on how the teacher can incorporate SEL, social emotional well-being, into a lesson. So when you're teaching maths, how do I ensure that I am actually incorporating maybe 3 minutes of yoga or some cool thing that you're doing so that a child is calm and they are centered as they are learning. So if every subject or every teacher, if I am going into that mindset that I'm not just teaching, but I'm also going to give you that support and to ensure that I am looking after your mental and emotional well-being, I think it'll be really nice, but of course this is ideal. And also important to acknowledge the teacher workload and everything else that they have going on. But I think these kinds of training, support and development, how can they do this meaningfully will be really useful.
Are you hearing anything from teachers themselves about how they are responding to what's been rolled out? I'm just curious to know when new plans like these are being rolled out, what do the teachers say first? What are their biggest concerns? What are their primary concerns? What are you hearing, Cheryl?
I think for teachers, they're quite used to how
These
things
changes?
happen
Okay.
and these changes.
They roll with the punches.
And they're like, okay, just another day for me, as long as my students are getting the best, like I'm there, I'm giving my best to my students, that's the most important. Like I remember when I was teaching, in that first year we had, it was 2013. So that was the then blueprint, right? And we had the PBS, Pentaksiran Berasaskan Sekolah.
Yes.
And because they haven't figured it out, so initially we had to bring big files in, we had to document everything, and then they said, no, you don't have to do it. But I was watching all the other teachers. I was a new teacher, so I was very anxious. I was watching all the other teachers, just go with it. Okay, if we need to buy a file, we'll buy a file. If we need to do this, we will do it. I think the way they rise to the occasion is very admirable, and they will go with it, right? But I think to what extent is something that we need to consider.
Right. Both of you are parents yourselves, and I'm curious to know what you think the blueprint asks of parents. How should parents who are understandably anxious about how it would impact their children's education in the future, what would you like them to bear in mind as this policy is rolled out? Dan, if I may begin with you.
I'm a huge proponent of parental involvement within the schooling system and schooling process. Even from the past blueprint, there was a shift which specifically talked about parental engagement. There were actually efforts, workshops, communities built around parents within a particular school district, and that still exists. So just kind of looking at it from that sort of policy experience, I hope the ministry continues that and the engagement of parents, and schools have to be encouraged to have parents involved, being very mindful that you also have dragon parents in WhatsApp groups, so let's have that respect. But for me as a parent, it ultimately goes back to certainty. I mean, my daughter Umbun, she's turning 2 this year, so we've got a couple of years to go. We are very much...
But she's part of the blueprint years.
She's part of the blueprint years, right? And she will be, we hope to enroll her at 6 in a public school, and we hope that at that point there is some kind of calmness within the system, and that the teachers are motivated, they're excited, or that they truly believe that the reform that starts this year and next year are ones which give them that support that they need to take care of my child for a future. So that's how I see it.
Okay. I want to ask you about how parents should react to the blueprint, because a lot of that has been also parents reacting to a lack of information, a lack of communication as well. Cheryl, do you want to respond?
I think it's always easier said than done, right? But when the blueprint announcement happened, I had this friend text me and she's like, oh my God, my child is not ready for year 1. And I was like, oh, don't worry, it's optional, so it's fine. I think our first reaction, of course, we love our child so much. The first reaction is, of course, anxiety and panic. But then time and time again, like Dan says, research shows that actually parent involvement is the #1 factor that leads to the success of a child. Time and time, every research leads to that. The #1, it's not teacher quality, it's not classroom sizes, it's actually your parent involvement. So the role of the parent is, no matter the changes, is how can I ensure my child is centered, how can I ensure that I am taking care of the well-being and the development of my child. That's the most important thing. And I find it hard to do as well, because if I see my child's marks like drop a little, I'm like, what's going on here? You're getting 60 for this? So it's very hard to pull back and to say, actually, is my child happy? Is she well supported? Am I caring for her enough? Does she have everything she needs to grow as a holistic human being? I think that is ultimately the role of the parent, but it's really tough to do. I will say this, my daughter is 9 and my son is 6, and the pressure to ensure that they are doing well in school is there, right? And when you see the marks drop a little, you're like, what's going on? So it's one to push them to their full potential, but another to ensure that they are well supported, cared for and loved.
Yeah. I love your article, which talked about how everyone should be involved in this. And I think that everyone has cliche as it sounds, everyone has a role to play to ensure the success of this plan. You mean everyone. Can I ask both of you to maybe help us think about what role we could play as part of society that wants to see this education plan succeed? Dad, if I may begin with you.
Like what we can play, I think first it's creating that community, right? The community of people who are parents, getting involved, spending your time, right? People talk about time, treasure, or talent. And I know there's some very high-performing schools in Petaling Jaya that what the school has done was they allow parents to help collect the fees for PIBG. 1 hour or 2 hours every week in the morning, parents are given exclusive slots to do different classes like reading or singing early in the morning, and parents volunteer their time for that. The second one is also called to the schools, right? Be open about engaging with parents, people on the ground. I think for me, wearing my policy hat, it's also being able to listen. Just to add a little bit to what to the earlier point, my Instagram timeline was flooded with reels of parents going, "Oh no, there's an exam." I don't know whether Cheryl, but a friend said the kids started studying thinking that the exams were happening next week or something like that. So for children, these things affect them in a different way. And I found myself being the communicator again, like, from my blast to the past from my time in the ministry, telling parents, don't worry, these things are gradual, this will take time, you're all affected in different ways, but ultimately there'll be support. And look, who doesn't want to see that our greatest national assets, for lack of a better word for the word assets, is our children's future. And this is how I feel strongly about it.
Cheryl.
So we always say that it takes a village to raise a child, but actually no one wants to be a villager because it's very hard, right?
It is. We want the village, but not to be a villager.
We don't want to be a villager. I recently visited a public school in Singapore, and I think the biggest factor for that school to be successful is how every member of the community had a part to play in that school's success. It had the university students coming in to mentor the students over the weekend. Whenever even one child, the community member sees them walking out the school, they will immediately call the school "Hey, why is this boy not in school?" The way they have gathered the support of everyone there was amazing, and that led to the school excellent performance, right? And really no child was left behind. So I think having that sense of this is my community, this is my village, this is my school, and I want to play a part in it is very important. We see that in some schools parent involvement is very high, and then in some schools they really struggle to get parents to attend the PIBG meeting or to be part of the PTA. But how can parents play an active role in this besides supporting your own child, but supporting the whole schooling community? I think that is really crucial.
Both of you, thank you so much for helping me think through some of the ways this has been playing out in the media and the headlines. I appreciate both of you for your insights. Thank you. That's all the time we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.